going up in boats and killing everybody that they met.
And then kind of doing their own version of the selfie on the dead body.
Yeah.
Europe's colonial empires reshaped the world, but at a devastating cost. Driven by profit, power, and the desire to civilize, they left behind a legacy of violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction. Entire civilizations were uprooted, millions lost their lives, and the scars are still visible today. From brutal massacres to resource theft, let's talk about some of the worst things European empires did. And no, we're not even touching the Atlantic slave trade yet.
Shrewd, enormously greedy, enormously ambitious, and with an absolutely brilliant sense of public relations.
Amritsar Massacre, 1919. When the British Raj officially began in 1858, the British Empire took direct control of India, governing it from London while placing a viceroy in Kolkata. Indians were given minor government roles, but as nationalism grew and administrative costs soared, they began demanding more control over their own affairs. After World War I, these demands intensified. Indians had supported the British war effort with soldiers and resources, but had no voice in governance. Protests became more frequent, and in response, the British banned public gatherings. On April 13, 1919, thousands gathered in Amritsar for a Sikh religious event, unaware they were violating British restrictions. British troops, under Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, opened fire without warning, killing hundreds and injuring over 1,000. Reports say Dyer and 90 soldiers fired 1,650 rounds for 10 minutes. The massacre became a turning point, fueling India's fight for independence. Mau Mau Uprising, 1952 to 1960. Kenya's Kikuyu people had long faced land dispossession under British rule, but by the 1950s, frustration boiled over. In 1952, a secret resistance group called the Mau Mau launched attacks against British forces and settlers, demanding freedom. Instead of addressing grievances, Britain outlawed the group, escalating the conflict and fueling years of brutal violence. With the situation escalating, the British declared a state of emergency in 1952. Prominent nationalists, including Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's future president, were accused of involvement and arrested. However, rather than weakening the resistance, this crackdown only intensified Mau Mau attacks, targeting both British forces and Kikuyu collaborators. For the next 8 years, the British struggled to suppress the movement. To combat the Mau Mau, British forces carried out mass arrests, sweeping up both suspected rebels and innocent civilians. Entire communities faced collective punishment, with many Kikuyu forced into reservations or detention camps. Inside these camps, torture, sexual abuse, and executions were common, used to break prisoners and extract information. The death toll remains disputed. Official records claim 11,000 Mau Mau were killed, including 1,090 executed as prisoners. Yet the Kenyan Human Rights Commission estimates that 90,000 Kenyans were executed, tortured, or maimed, while 160,000 were held in brutal conditions. In stark contrast, only 32 white settlers were killed during the conflict. Irish Potato Famine, 1846 to 1852. The Irish potato famine of the mid-1800s was one of the darkest chapters in Ireland's history. Around 1 million people died from starvation or disease, while another million were forced to leave. Although the famine wasn't directly caused by British rule, their policies worsened its impact. At the time, Ireland was under British control, and when a devastating potato blight struck in 1845, the British response was inadequate. Since potatoes were the primary food source, the blight left countless people without sustenance. Queen Victoria repealed grain laws and sent food aid, but it was too expensive for most, and many didn't know how to prepare it. Meanwhile, Ireland continued exporting food while its own people starved. Instead of actively helping, the British government took a hands-off approach, letting the crisis worsen. The famine reshaped Ireland, leaving lasting scars. Spain and the Incas, 1532 to 1572. The Inca Empire was already in turmoil when the Spanish arrived in 1531. A brutal civil war between brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar had left the kingdom weakened, and resentment among smaller tribes under Inca rule only added to the instability. Sensing an opportunity, Spanish conquistadors Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro advanced with just 180 men, facing an empire divided and vulnerable. In November 1532, Pizarro met Atahualpa, who had just claimed victory in the Civil War. While the meeting seemed peaceful, both sides were plotting betrayal. The very next day, Pizarro ambushed the Incas, massacring 7,000 warriors while suffering no losses. Atahualpa was taken hostage, and over the next several months, the Incas delivered vast amounts of gold and silver in an attempt to secure his release. Despite accepting the ransom, the Spanish executed Atahualpa in 1533, effectively breaking the Inca leadership. Without a strong leader, the empire crumbled. Over the next 4 decades, the Spanish seized Inca cities, finally crushing the last stronghold in 1572. Beyond warfare, European diseases like smallpox devastated the region, wiping out up to 90% of the Andean population. Spain, the Aztec, in Tenochtitlan, 1519, 1521. The arrival of the Spanish in what is now Mexico marked the beginning of one of history's most devastating conquests. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of the Aztec Empire, which controlled much of the region from its capital, Tenochtitlan. Hoping to avoid conflict, Emperor Montezuma II sent gifts, but Cortés had no intention of leaving. Determined to claim the land and its riches, Cortés ensured his men had no way to retreat by burning their ships. Along the way to Tenochtitlan, he gained support from groups that opposed Aztec rule. One such event was the massacre at Cholula, where Spanish forces killed thousands. Accounts vary from 3,000 to as many as 30,000 people. When Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan on November 9, 1519, the Aztecs initially welcomed him, believing he might be the god Quetzalcoatl. But within days, Cortés betrayed their trust by taking Montezuma hostage and forcing him to pledge loyalty to Spain. This weakened Montezuma's authority, leading to unrest. The Aztecs soon revolted, and after months of conflict, the Spanish laid siege to Tenochtitlan. By August 1521, the city had fallen. The combination of starvation, warfare, and disease, especially smallpox, had decimated the population. Spanish forces, along with their indigenous allies, looted the city and slaughtered survivors, showing no mercy. One of Cortés's allies, Prince Ixtlilxochitl of Texcoco, was one of the few who showed compassion, attempting to protect women and children from the brutal violence. The destruction didn't end there. Over the next few decades, the Spanish systematically erased Tenochtitlan, building New Spain on its ruins. By 1568, out of the estimated 30 million Aztecs who lived in the empire before the conquest, only about 3 million remained. The massive death toll was caused by a combination of disease, war, and starvation. The fall of the Aztec Empire wasn't just a military victory for the Spanish, it was a complete dismantling of an advanced civilization, its culture, and its people. The remnants of Tenochtitlan now lie beneath modern-day Mexico City, a silent testament to the empire that once ruled the land. Dutch East Indies, 1945 to 1949. For centuries, the Dutch had a strong presence in Southeast Asia, controlling islands like Sumatra, Java, and parts of Borneo, territories collectively known as the Dutch East Indies. In 1602, they established the Dutch East India Company, VOC, to dominate the spice trade. Around the same time, the British set up their own rival company, the British East India Company, while the declining Portuguese struggled to maintain their influence. By 1619, the VOC had set up its headquarters in Batavia, now Jakarta, holding control until it collapsed in 1799. Afterward, the Dutch government took over, officially naming the territories the Dutch East Indies. Dutch rule lasted until World War II, when Japan seized control. After Japan's defeat, the Indonesians declared independence in 1945. The Dutch, unwilling to let go, launched military campaigns to regain power, leading to violent clashes. Brutal tactics were used, including mass executions led by Captain Raymond Westerling. Despite this, Indonesia resisted fiercely. By 1949, after years of conflict, the Dutch finally recognized Indonesia's independence. The exact number of casualties remains unknown, but the Dutch lost 6,000 soldiers, while Indonesian deaths were significantly higher. though impossible to calculate accurately. The British and Australian Aboriginal massacres, 1790s, 1890s. When British ships arrived in New South Wales in 1788, they began an era of significant change for Australia. The British had set out to establish a settlement, but their presence quickly transformed the land and its people. At first, relationships with the native Aboriginal people were relatively peaceful, but as more Europeans arrived, the impact on Aboriginal communities became increasingly devastating. Over time, the disruption caused by the newcomers led to resistance and conflict. From the very beginning, the British used Australia as a penal colony, sending convicts to the farthest reaches of the empire. Between 1788 and 1823, most settlers in Australia were either criminals or sailors. But by 1793, free settlers began arriving, further encroaching on Aboriginal land. Throughout the 1810s to the 1830s, violence erupted as British forces clashed with Aboriginal groups, resulting in numerous massacres, such as the Appin Massacre in 1816, where 14 Aboriginal people were killed. The Mile Creek Massacre in 1838 and others followed, intensifying the brutal treatment of Aboriginal communities. The British slowly expanded their control across Australia, often meeting Aboriginal groups with violence. In Victoria, between 1833 in 1834, between 60 and 20,000 Aboriginal people were killed. Meanwhile, the Kearney people in Gippsland saw their population plummet, from thousands in 1840 to fewer than 100 by the late 1850s. Along with violence, disease took a heavy toll. By 1920, the Aboriginal population had dropped by 90%. Thousands were killed or displaced, forced into labor under harsh conditions. In the late 1800s, British authorities began forcibly removing Aboriginal children from their families, placing them with Europeans, stripping them of their language, customs, and identity. French Algeria, 1954 to 1962. As France lost control of its colonies globally, it tightened its grip on Algeria, which had been under French rule since 1830. Initially, Algeria was seen as an extension of France, especially after the arrival of French settlers known as Pieds Noirs in the 1840s. This led to significant displacement of local Algerian farmers, forcing many into poverty. By the 1870s, one-third of the indigenous Algerian population had died due to disease, starvation, and early resistance efforts. Though Algerians occasionally fought back, the overwhelming number of European settlers complicated matters and gave rise to a stronger resistance movement. In 1945, Algerians staged peaceful protests, celebrating their victory over Germany in World War II while calling for independence. However, the French responded with brutal force, particularly during the May 1945 protests in Sétif and Guelma, where thousands of Algerians were killed. By 1954, these tensions sparked the Algerian War of Independence, with the National Liberation Front, FLN, leading the fight. The conflict lasted until 1962 and was marked by widespread violence, including torture, bombings, and massacres. Estimates of casualties range from 90,000 to 1.5 million Algerians. The Belgian Congo, 1885-1908. When discussing history's darkest chapters, King Leopold II's brutal rule over the Congo Free State often goes overlooked. But what happened there was nothing short of devastating. In 1885, Leopold seized control of vast Central African territory under the guise of bringing civilization. In reality, he saw the Congo as a business empire, rich in ivory, rubber, and timber. His main goal? Boost Belgium's status and amass personal wealth. By the time he was forced to surrender control in 1908, he had built an immense fortune at the cost of millions of lives. During the late 19th century, rubber became highly valuable due to the rise of bicycles and automobiles. Leopold capitalized on this demand, forcing Congolese workers into brutal labor conditions. Entire families were held hostage to ensure rubber quotas were met. Failure to comply led to gruesome punishments, whippings that left permanent scars, starvation, executions, and even mutilation. Many had their hands or genitals severed as warnings. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, ruled through terror. Villages that resisted were burned to the ground, and soldiers collected severed hands as proof they had used their bullets effectively. If not enough dead bodies were found, they simply cut hands from the living. Women and children suffered immensely. Many were assaulted, starved, or killed, while others fled into the forests only to be hunted down. The world eventually took notice. In 1890, American journalist George Washington Williams exposed Leopold's atrocities, describing widespread forced labor and mass killings. His revelations sparked global outrage. Under growing pressure, Belgium took control in 1908, renaming it the Belgian Congo. By then, an estimated 10 million Congolese lives had been lost. Leopold's so-called civilizing mission left behind a legacy of devastation that lingers to this day. French Haiti, 1790s, 1804. In the late 1700s, the fight for freedom in Haiti gained momentum as both enslaved people and free people of color, known as gens de couleur, united against French colonial rule. Starting in 1791, these groups carried out revolts and attacks on plantations, killing hundreds of French settlers and forcing the French to retaliate violently. The brutality of French troops was evident as they committed horrific acts, including executing chained blacks in hospitals and drowning captured rebels at sea. By 1794, Toussaint Louverture emerged as the leader of the rebel forces. Despite seeming to align with the French after they abolished slavery, Louverture continued to push for Haitian autonomy. Tensions escalated in 1801 when Napoleon sent troops to reassert control, sparking even worse conflict. French forces resorted to atrocities, including suffocating thousands of black Haitians on the ship Le Stifler. After years of struggle, Haiti declared independence on January 1, 1804. Though Louverture was captured and died in France in 1803, the revolt ultimately succeeded, but it cost the lives of an estimated 400,000 people. Boer concentration camps, 1900–1902. South Africa saw two Boer wars, with the first occurring in the late 19th century and the second, known as the South African War, taking place from 1899 to 1902. During this conflict, the British rounded up Boer civilians, descendants of Dutch settlers, and placed them in concentration camps. The Boers, primarily farmers, lived in the Transvaal and Orange Free State, regions north of British-controlled South Africa. When these two Boer republics united in 1897, Britain saw it as a potential threat. In response, they deployed troops along the border. The Boers demanded their withdrawal, but when Britain refused, war erupted in October 1899. Initially, the Boers had the upper hand, but Britain's superior numbers and weaponry eventually turned the tide. With nearly 500,000 troops against 90,000 Boer fighters, the British captured key Boer cities by 1900 and absorbed the republics into their empire. Despite continued guerrilla resistance, the war ended in 1902 with the Treaty of Vereeniging, forcing the Boers to accept British rule. While 100,000 British and 14,000 Boer soldiers perished, the war's worst casualties came from British-run concentration camps. These camps, meant to suppress resistance, housed Boer civilians as well as black South Africans. By September 1901, 34 camps held over 110,000 Boers, and the conditions were deplorable. Starvation, disease, and poor sanitation caused as many as 3,000 deaths per month. By war's end, around 27,000 Boer civilians, 15% of their population, had died. Black South Africans also suffered, though their plight received less attention. Between 14,000 and 20,000 black civilians perished in separate camps. The South African War remains a dark chapter in history, remembered not only for its battles, but for the suffering inflicted on civilians. British India and the famines, 1865–1943. British rule in India wasn't just about governance, it also oversaw some of the worst famines in history. Between 1865 and 1943, millions of people in India, including present-day Bangladesh and Pakistan, starved while the British continued exporting food elsewhere. Take the Orissa famine of 1865, for example. The British ignored the crisis until their own troops started suffering. By the time relief efforts began in 1866, it was too late. One-third of Orissa's population had already perished. The same pattern repeated itself during the Madras famine of 1876–78, where an estimated 4 to 5 million people died, while British officials prioritized shipments to other parts of the empire. The Bengal famine of 1943 is perhaps the most infamous. During World War II, while India was suffering, the British exported over 70,000 tons of rice between January and July, food that could have saved nearly 500,000 lives. Desperate parents abandoned their starving children, some even taking their own lives. People scavenged for anything edible, grass, roots, leaves, just to survive. By the time it ended, up to 3.5 million people had died, leaving a dark stain on British colonial rule. German Namibia and the Herero Genocide, 1904-1907. Germany controlled much of Africa in the late 1800s, including what is now Namibia, then called Southwest Africa. Following the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European powers divided up the continent, and Germany took control of Namibia. They negotiated its borders with Angola under Portuguese rule and made deals with Britain for access to the Zambezi River. By the 1890s, the Germans began seizing land and cattle from the local Herero and Nama people. Tensions escalated, leading to uprisings, and in 1904, violence broke out. After an early victory by African troops, Germany took control, pushing the Herero and Nama into reservations and camps. German commanders, including Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, issued orders to kill or forcibly remove the Herero, with no regard for women and children. The genocide, lasting until 1907, resulted in the deaths of up to 80,000 Herero and 10,000 Nama, devastating their populations. The brutal legacy of European colonialism still shapes the world today. What do you think was the most devastating impact? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe for more.